Hello everyone, after months of suspension we resume our historical regional series that has been an important element of Schwerpunkt's backbone as touring the entire Europe in some local political depth. Today we talk about 15th century Florence, that as far as the sub-stack of the Italian regional content, we essentially remained anchored to this city for obvious reasons, disproportional importance, documentation, and more. So that at some point we will have to compensate with other, stories from the rest of the peninsula. Obviously enough, I don't know how often we will keep updating again the regional series, but I plan to resume it at an important level, at least the next cycle, say 4. I don't ask you to to realize how the entire mechanism works. 15th century Florence is a huge topic. And I said it in other videos so much so that I decided to add a new branch to the cycle specifically for that. We haven't discussed that much the late medieval polities, in particular the Italian lordships. I want to add something on late medieval Germany as well, because I feel that that's a bit like a void, a gap in my content. There is more Medician history coming, also expanding well into the 16th century. Then we can think of adding yet another, or at least expanding the regional series on also early modern history. Some of you asked me about that. In any case, it's really an infinite pool of possible content. We don't even have to ask to materialize such content, because practice can surpass the fantasy in many ways. Talking about 15th century Florence, of course, we're talking about the Medici family. That's, in fact, the extent I was wondering about, not having addressed this family's, this house's history enough on Schwerpunkt. I think I made just a couple videos talking about them, specifically the age of Cosimo, which is the one that we're looking at, especially today. I plan today to basically arrive to the mid-15th century, so also Cosimo's death, his son Piero's succession, up to eventually the rise of the grandson Lorenzo il Magnifico. So we saw in the last episode about Florentine history how during especially the second half of the 14th century, the Italian system of power had basically started pivoting around a sort of balance that would be at some point even formalized by Lorenzo de Medici, as you know, during with the Treaty of Lodi, that we also discussed in our video. So secondly, we talked about that as well. Florence was, let's say, the weaker of the stronger powers in the peninsula. Right, this system, as you know, had recompacted under the lead of some major rulers like the Duke of Milan, the Republic of Venice, the Papal States, the Kingdom of Naples. Tuscany had been largely hegemonized by Florence, that, however, in spite of its great economical development, had never really been able to translate this in some sort of more politically and territorially cohesive state building. Florence had been championing some sort of confederal order that they sort of propagandized for some kind of republican system, a liberal one in open opposition to the Milanese so-called tyranny, except, as you know from ancient classical history, the tyrants, and not even in late medieval historiography, were considered properly with a negative term, right? I made also a video about the concept of despotism, if I'm not wrong. The fact that the Italian lordships in historiography went down often from the Anglo-American side of the story as this kind of monarchic degenerations, while they were literally the single most republican systems in the entirety of Europe. So, what kind of tyrannies were these to begin with compared to the major monarchies out there, and even compared to probably even countries that were more politically pulverized, but that had none of sort of the citizenry ethos of these Italian city-states. We've seen how this balance of power had been fundamentally held, especially again in the 14th century, in this Venetian-Florentine alliance against Milan, the latter being the most powerful state, the one that really was more of a state in terms of political and uniformity, institutional solidity, and in fact military power at large. So much so that during the 15th century, the Venetians would start to create a terra firma state out of scratch, just to, in fact, threaten the same Milan from actually up to a few tens of kilometers away from that. I made multiple videos, if anything, about... We already dealt with Milan for the original series, so you can look at their side of the story, so to say. From that, we shall also make something more in-depth, because it's a lot of history, but indeed there is a bit less compared to Florence in strictly documentary historiographical terms, even though, again, it's huge, right? Of course, a lot also modern scholarship has invested itself in study the very, otherwise, like by European standards, still very well documented Ambrosian history. I made recently some videos about Venetian warfare. We looked at some battles such as Caravaggio, the Riccardina Molinella, that was the name. We'll keep talking about the Condottieri in particular, because here we are in the full age of that. So here, these powers were not yet tired of fighting against one another before realizing that these constant wars were not going to simply endanger the system, because these Italian city-states were, even when taking on a literally provincial, but not regional dimension, so well entrenched in their respective spheres of influence that couldn't simply be dislodged by one another. Right, there could have been some sort of major plan, also of association or confederacy, but Italy was not also a sealed-off system. There was a constant foreign interference, and the Italians themselves were the first ones who were sort of drawing like a lot of forces from that. At this point, not really becoming dependent on foreign factions that will be essentially just a 16th century Renaissance thing. With Italian wars, as you know, large swathes of the peninsula will fall under the control in the sphere of influence of foreign powers. But still, like in a way that tended to make the entire picture a bit more effervescent. Besides, Milan was routinely plagued, in spite of its enormous power, by a non-standardized and better defined system of succession, because this state was held by a proper dynasty in a virtually monarchic fashion. This also originally non-feudal nobility had been recognized by the Holy Roman Emperors in specific official titles. As you know, the same Medici in our Italian families coming from sort of... We'll talk about their origins, because we talk of them like sort of third estators that became noblemen. It's not quite the case. This was also originally some militus clans. And so it depends really what kind of ultimate origin you're looking at, that they will essentially become a royalty themselves that would marry to the greatest houses of Europe. Think about the Valois in the case of the Medici. The Visconti territories at the beginning of the 15th century have been split through one of the routine redistribution of power among three successors of the ducal house. In the process, one of them, Gabriele Maria Visconti, sold Pisa, the city of Pisa, to the Republic of Florence for 200,000 florins. It was a relatively fair cipher at the time, one that for which you would pay a major European city at the time. I made a series about medieval Pisa that illustrates, especially in this period, the very quick fall. Like in a century prior, the Pisans, even after Meloria, actually did not bring to any scalar decline of peasant power in and of itself, especially as far as land forces were concerned, was a might to be reckoned with. The peasants bit the hell out of the Florentines on multiple occasions, and they simply exhausted themselves in the second half of the 14th century, so much so that they had, this was completely normal, ending up especially in the aftermath of the great late medieval crisis. And they entrusted themselves to foreign, in this case still Italian, signory of the Visconti that had infiltrated Tuscany in their hegemonic attempts all over central and northern Italy. And because of different deals that are very complex, like at some point we will enter into the actual depths of this, because again, I started a series especially to do this. But here we have to talk about 50 years of Florentine history. Understand we can't simply descend into the details. The bottom line here, the highlight, is that Florence managed to acquire the most important portual city in Tuscany, former maritime republic, as Florence had always needed a free, open access to the sea. Right, all these cities had managed to do so through the various trade routes across the same Italy. Florence and Milan were among the larger cities in Europe. Milan in particular, probably the first, together with Paris. We don't know exactly which one was bigger, but without having an access to the sea very often. But again, the political alliances of the system, as far as it remained relatively fluid, especially across the French, had allowed supplies to pass through and so on. Florence had been the richest city in the entire globe. In the first half of the 14th century, at this point, it had remained an important financial power, but at the same time was, as many powers after the late medieval crisis, trying mostly to territorialize, right, to invest mostly in land rather than in the markets that had suffered, in fact, from the same Florence, and also because of the lack of payment from the major crowns in Europe that had been subsidized for their wars by the Tuscans in particular, had collapsed. The peasants, however, they were unwilling still to submit to their long-standing adversaries. Right? You can basically control the cities, but you have to send some troops that have to take control and so on. And of course, also the Visconti had ruled these relatively peripheral centers compared to Lombardy, to the bulk of Milanese power, in if not in a proxy way, at least not with a radical iron fist. At least in Lombardy they would, because they had the strategic capacity to do so. They had, however, reached to places, again, like Tuscany, Umbria, etc., trying to choke Florence, but just, in fact, making leverage on the rivalries of these local Tuscan cities. And so it had come to that. Like, the peasants had required a Milanese protection because they wanted to escape Florentine power. And when the Milanese themselves, in moment of their crisis, decide to sell Pisa out for cash, the Florentine army under the command of Maso degli Albizzi, that, as we've seen also in the previous episodes, were one of the strongest families in Florence at the time, seized the same Pisa with force. There are beautiful paintings from the Italian Renaissance depicting this. We are on October the 9th, 1406. This, by the way, occurred following an extended siege marked by numerous brutalities, as the Florentines were not tender against the peasants after all the bad blood that had run between them. In 1422, the Duchy of Milan proposed a treaty to Florence's leaders. Remember, Florence is a republic. All right, there are a few hegemonic families that it had come also to that point, so it had a tendentially monarchic direction, but formally also under the Medici would remain a republic, at least until the 16th century in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, barring Florence from intervening in Milan's imminent war with the Republic of Genoa as well. You understand how the same Milanese at this point were trying yet again to contain the old Florentine coming back. At least Florence had never been this enormous military might to be reckoned with. The Milanese were stronger, but again, in terms of local circumstances and different theaters, now the Florentines having acquired Pisa, have really a substantial power to spend. Florence agreed to the agreement because, after all, they didn't want to go at full war with Milan, but the Ambrosian city breached its own terms by seizing a Florentine border town in a new change of thought. The conservative ruling faction in Florence pushed at this point for open war with Milan, while the citizens roughly decried this position, fearing especially steep tax hikes. It's a bit like the spirit of the year, and what will characterize Florence also later, think about Machiavelli, etc. The Florentines were in many ways run by this great banking families. They had chivalric military traditions that are very well documented also by other European observers. They were basically, again, like knights with more financial assets, right, than the average. However, this sort of republican and in part mercantile character, especially of Florence, that is a bit like the icon of this extreme in the peninsula that otherwise had, in fact, more seigneurial and militarized mentalities, did not want to pay, which is a pretty bad recipe for sort of political and strategical consideration. And hence the notion that Florence did not want to spend much for mercenaries. If you had seen, as we did in our videos, Florence at the end of the 13th century, the beginning of the 14th, you realize that they had a military activity equal or even superior in certain cases to the one of Milan. And at the time, Florence was actually quite active and one of the earliest and more eager to acquire mercenaries. It is just the big crisis of the mid-14th century that exhausts that sort of moral rather than material willingness. It's a cultural shift. We've seen how critical politically the previous century had been. Florence had managed to stand on its own legs, but without having a particularly, as we've seen, expansionistic mentality, had de facto financially absorbed the surrounding cities, and so the Confederacy of Florence, headed by Florence, was evolving according to similar patterns of the other Italian regional powers, with this less centralized ethos and less convinced sort of kind of military policy. In any case, at this point, of course, they had an army, they had some important forces on their own. This is the age of the condottieri, and so again, it's basically this professional troops plus militias. Again, we made so many videos about late medieval European armies. You can check out in the relative playlists. Florence declared war on Milan, right, with the support of the Republic of Venice. Otherwise, again, Florence alone against Milan would have not really gone anywhere. And in fact, it actually emerged triumphant, right? The war ended in 1427, compelling the Visconti of Milan to accept a disadvantageous treaty. During this period, it's always, of course, a border thing, right? The Florentines never venture in significant numbers into the Po Valley. It's mostly, again, struggling in these border areas where this city or another is contended in the fringe, mostly for controlling the Apennine passes that are so critical for international trade. In parallel, in this period, regardless of all the struggles, Florence underwent a remarkable artistic, architectural, and literary revival, or further expansion, because this had really started with Humanism back in the day. You can't even say when it had begun. Normally, we spot Petrarch, because at that point we see some features of what would be later known as the Renaissance taking place, especially the courtly dimension, the philological interest, etc. But before that, we've seen in other videos, Florence and most of Italy had really been at the forefront of some very sophisticated civic, artistic, literary, and even military renaissance that is much more sort of even already humanistically focused. If you look at Italian art, even we've seen it in other videos, even talking about Byzantine history. Most of Byzantine art is not much that you remember from history book from Constantinople, but from, say, Ravenna, etc. And so there is something about the further evolution of the Renaissance that, especially modernism, has tended to overly inflate, forgetting the peak of the great medieval civilization in the 13th and the 14th century. Here we witness, say, our more familiar Florentine Renaissance, per se. And we also realize that this could happen in political and military circumstances that would, however, be less than ideal. For example, during the aforementioned war, that had not been sort of a walk in the park, where in 1424 Florence had suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Zagonara. And these are lots of money and people's lives that are lost. Especially the financial strain of war, because the Florentines didn't even send too much manpower out there. It wasn't even they would have had to pay for it. So that's the reason to begin with. But there was some sort of general concern from the citizenry that in these Italian states had grown ever more detached from politics, and that's why the condottieri had emerged as basically proxy and sort of independent businessmen of war. I made a pretty hefty video about them, and we will hopefully keep talking about them. So this financial strain of war, coupled with the ambitions in the construction, for example, on the awe-inspiring Dome of Santa Maria del Fiore that dominates the city still today, designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, a marvel to both contemporaries and modern observers, required the introduction of new taxes as well. So there was still a general municipal pride, a lot of money indeed, and some pretty straightforward and innovating intelligentsia that basically most of Europe could just dream of. And so behind all these contradictions, Florence develops more because of its general cultural prestige than its feats of arms, still remaining relatively isolated from the major expansionistic aims of other powers, like especially Milan. And we make the series also for sort of seeing what was happening in each city, because at some point we will make something more comprehensive and say, what was this war about? What was the Battle of Zagonara? At some point we will enter the depths of them. But it's also important to realize that, in fact, there was a specific good enough sort of, since we're still floating, okay, let's go. It's not in history. There is always this lack of urgency, because that means to spend, right? And only when problems become very often too big that people intervene too late. This is a bit like the case of Florence in some historical perspective, but at the time, things didn't even look so disastrous, of course. It's mostly a condition of minority compared to the other Italian and foreign powers that Florence will experience as the century dragged on, right? In fact, also some of the greatest achievements of Lorenzo il Magnifico, we will see now, would consist in saving the Republic, even though there wasn't even basically an army standing, and mostly because of this broader Italian policy of balance, of equilibrium, as they called that. Besides, the aforementioned war with Milan generated an immense debt of approximately 4,200,000 florins. This starts being really structurally crashing. To manage this, the state overhauled its tax system, replacing the estimo, which taxed only the income, with the proper catasto, which is the cadastro, in fact, which assessed a citizen's total wealth, right? And this was very modern for the time. That the later Tuscany, especially under the Habsburgs in the 19th century, with one of the most institutionally modernized and liberal systems in Europe. That was a vibe that Florence got always from these times. You can't argue. In 1427, the Signoria, as it was generally speaking called, like the broader concept of lordship, right? Even though, because Florence was actually called Signoria Florentina, well, it was also understood as a republic, of course, but in general, the concept of power wielding from this or that, head figure, or even the same government, was considered as a lordship of some sort. Even though Florence had some of the earliest statal centralizations in Europe, but at this point, things were gradually, as further became oligarchizing, so to say, and privatizing, as we'll witness now with the rise of the Medici. The cadastre was later expanded in 1432 with the so-called Valsente to address abrupt financial shortfalls in public funds, which evidently expresses the communal capacity to rely also on the various banking groups that were behind the government to prop up public finance. And that's basically it. Like, the Medici will rise to power by literally buying the Florentine signory with their astronomical amount of money. In general, this seemed as an early attempt to some sort of more a fair level of taxation. Let's say the state will inject more money also through privates, through different mechanisms that will sort of privatize power, yes, but will also maintain will prevent the population from suffering even more. Then, say, for example, from the sudden financial costs that, say, a military defeat could entail, it was still the Florentine system per se, and again, mostly because of the great banking families behind power that this was feasible. The system levied taxes on families based on their estimated wealth, targeting the substantial fortunes of merchants and banking families themselves, who also thus wielded political influence because they asked for something in exchange. In theory, you could simply subvert the system, saying, okay, I will not pay this, but you would get something in exchange. The cadastral records offer a vivid portrait of Florence at the time, by the way, though the tax was soon discontinued as it threatened the interests of the affluent, as well, as we just pointed out, in certain circumstances. The Strozzi family, other very important one, was in this the wealthiest, right? And it's in relation to the Medici that sort of this power also is measurable. The Medici are actually an old family in Florence. They appear from, I think, the 12th century, so it's not like they were the suddenly, enriched bankers that emerged. No, these were substantial aristocratic families that were into the Florentine political and military business from quite some time. There are beautiful pages written, for example, by Milan at the time of the revolt against the Duke of Athens that shows how active the Medici had been in different. And you find them as early as that and before in the history of Florence. Right. Naturally, the term Medici stems from the fact that apparently in their early era they would have practiced some kind of medical profession, and or that often also involved some important trade with spices, for example, so increasing their wealth, their assets along the way. Their fortunes laid in fact, their landed property in the Mugello region, which is in the northeast of Florence, in the Apennines. It's a place where the Florentines got some of their war horses, because there were important pastures out there. They are, again, named by the sources since the late 12th century, and they had been quietly rising, having gained a strong reputation for supporting popular causes in particular, mostly because, again, they had been among the lowest ranks of aristocracy, but still, right, important enough as, again, military clans on their own. The common people, excluded from governance, repeatedly attempted to dismantle the oligarchy until they formed an alliance with the Medici. We've seen how in the 14th century, as it happened basically across all of Europe, all the popular revolts across the continent were beaten. All right, there isn't a single instance of a revolt or rebellion or uprising of the fourth estate or the third estate that ends well. Everywhere in Europe, everybody's beaten down. Like the Hussites destroyed their own same country. In England, the lords are put down. The Jacquerie in France is crushed. The salaried workers' rebellions in the textile industries of the Italian and the Flemish city centers are put down. Florence had witnessed, as we have seen in the previous topics, the Ciompi revolt. That was exactly this in their own key. And Florence was, again, a major hub of and cradle of textile production that had surpassed the same Flemish clothing quality, with the crisis that was affecting Flanders as well, bringing many Flemish to leave and work in Florence and local industry working for the local industries. Cosimo de Medici is this extraordinary figure, the son of Giovanni di Bicci de Medici, who took over as a head of the Medici Bank in particular, becoming a key figure in Florence's government. Recognizing that the family's vast wealth needed political safeguarding due to increasingly large and risky financial ventures, Cosimo began his rise to power within the Florentine Republic in a more, again, political direction. His characteristic prudence was evident. He avoided seeking outright rule through a coup or pursuing prominent government position, which actually would be the normality, especially the latter, but coups also were all over the place, let's say, in late medieval Italy, especially to unhinge, in fact, the position of certain figures rather than the cities themselves from position of power. Of course, he was a Florentine. He had these great assets, etc. He prefers to operate discreetly, orchestrating a network of loyal allies who held critical roles in the city's institutions. And not just in Florence, because again, a banker has a lot of money going to a lot of different places. I made multiple videos explaining how the Italian financial system was basically still dominant in Europe and the Mediterranean, in great parts of Western Eurasia, even if you consider at least the engine, right, that it represented, and that therefore, and the Italians had been on the forefront in creating say accounting mechanisms, banknotes, proper branches scattered all over Western Europe in particular. This meant that this money went to subsidize certain powers that could become, in this sense, obliged to these moneylenders. Power at the time was largely held in Florence by the Albizzi, as we said before, Niccolò da Uzzano, and select members of the Strozzi, Peruzzi, and Castellani families. The Peruzzi, as you know, were the famous bankers of the early 14th century that, together with the Bardi, underwent a severe crisis that engulfed the whole continent. Also, Boccaccio was historically tied to them. He worked in Naples in one of his branches, in fact, for in the Angevin kingdom. As Cosimo's influence and alliances grew, the ruling elite began to view him as a threat. Of course, his machinations could not be hidden. However, since they were really not, again, he was not really involved with public institutions, with official magistracies, etc. He was just like a private citizen, in that sense, shielded also by that sense of Florentine republican rights, right, that safeguarded the individuals that made up, again, like citizens are not just like the average person, all right? The aforementioned salaried workers, for example, were not citizens of Florence, even if they worked and lived, at least in their suburbs, right? The Italian citizenry was incredibly proud, and they still essentially upheld the Romano-Germanic concept of being free men in arms, even though, again, after the late medieval crisis, the world had undergone a massive demilitarization of the commoners, and this was the case as well. In fact, we're talking about an aristocratic house, which is something different, and some that can indeed pay. Troops can pay people within the same city. Remember that here, all these various families have pretty massive palaces / fortresses within these metropolises in Europe, essentially like castles within the cities themselves. It's a very complicated net here. I'm skipping also much about urbanistics at this point, etc., but it's all intertwined. Again, I have to make this video. It's not that easy to condensate everything in one. After a disastrous war with the neighboring Republic of Lucca, that I also made a video on regarding the Battle of Petrovaradin in 1716, the Count Stefano Orselli, and the fact that in fact this principality will remain independent from the broader Medici and Tuscany for that long time, showing also how the limits of Florence in that regard. In 1433, Cosimo, as family hand, was arrested and exiled to Venice. Right, we'll talk about Lucca in and of itself. It's a very interesting city just north of Pisa that therefore was very strategic. The Florentines had been after it since the 30s, the 40s of the 14th century, but it still defied its control. Nevertheless, this was yet another war lost. And Cosimo was sort of, if not scapegoated, at least found guilty of, at least in the moment of general crisis, was attacked, and he managed to escape, if anything, to Venice through also the good deeds of his allies, including, in fact, the same republic, the Serenissima. On September the 1st, 1433, at the urging of Rinaldo degli Albizzi, Bernardo Guadagni was appointed as Gonfaloniere di Giustizia, which was essentially a police kind of justiciary militia office of some sort, alongside a signoria firmly aligned with the Albizzi and their followers, meaning that essentially the enemies of Cosimo had at this point entrenched themselves in the city, also to control, in fact, the mob in case of possible uprisings, etc. That's how, in the September 1433, Cosimo had been imprisoned by the same signoria. He had been charged with the incitation to conspiracy and plots within the city and internationally provoking the war with Lucca. So, of course, in times of military defeat, political destabilization, coups were more likely, and surely Cosimo was behind some, at least, policies, some movements in this. But in many ways, he was also not really openly guilty of too much in any case, rather than having opposed this rival families. In fact, these vague and fabricated accusations were meant to lead to his execution. They wanted to take him out entirely. Rinaldo degli Albizzi finally lacked the resolve to see the matter to its extreme. So through a strategically placed bribes, in the end, Cosimo escaped a death sentence, and his punishment was reduced to exile while he was already abroad, marking the so-called first expulsion of the Medici. We will see which other ones would occur later on. Following Cosimo's departure to Padua and Venice, so properly in the Venetian Republic, in northeastern Italy, the Republican institutions faced persistent instability in Florence. There were lots of people who liked Cosimo, who backed the Medici, who depended already as their clients on their bank, and more. Unlike his father, Rinaldo degli Albizzi lacked the fortitude to manage the deteriorating situation and failed to control the electoral process, which was quite complicated. Florence had a sort of very complex and articulated, in fact, republican system that reflected the aforementioned lack of centralization, and lots of different limits could be placed to the signoria at a point by different elements of the state, so to say. Cosimo would avoid such mistake. We will see also later on how. He would come back to Florence, as you know, assuming de facto the signoria himself. Once in power, he probably entered Florence. It was a sort of a glorious entree, etc. And he, at that point, would meticulously control the candidate selections, effectively eliminating random draws for example. So it's either one direction or the other. You can't stall political processes. This work essentially without removing, let's say, the institution per se, but essentially bribing people and making the whole mechanism working more smoothly. Again, because the Medici Bank was by far the biggest at this point. Think about this. In the previous century, Florence had been the richest per capita wealth community in the entire world. In the 15th century, this is post-crisis, it is not anymore, at least it doesn't have the same absolute wealth as before. However, the system has become more oligarchic. It means that that wealth at large, while shrinking in absolute terms, was also taken over by fewer people. And by the 15th century, the Medici became the richest people that, as far as we know, had, at least in the Middle Ages, existed. We can't speak of sort of banking, etc. You can't argue that this was the first time in the world happening, meaning that nobody, even in the 14th century, had ever owned so much financial power. All right. In the 14th century, again, there was more wealth, but this was more evenly distributed. In a more, even among the oligarchs, in a more egalitarian system. In later, in terms to the later, what we call ancien regime, as actually starting from the 14th century, as opposed to being some sort of pan-medieval stuff. And the Medici were, in fact, the guys who literally took over the entire Florence. I mean, in the early 14th century, this would have been completely unthinkable, right? This is if literally the entire city is de facto property of this ruler that also acts, as we will see now, not as a king, not trying to centralize whatever. That would have required too much, like maintaining in that sense, but also like the pulse of the citizenry, because this wasn't an absolute power. It's not just by buying people that you actually controlled whatever they do. That's sort of doesn't work like that. And still, in fact, there are lots of rich and powerful people. At some point, we'll even try, as you know, to take out the Medici and external powers that were more powerful than Florence, as we've seen, including the Venetians that sent Cosimo back to take over power in Florence, for example. But evidently because the Florentine basis was already wavering against the Albizzi. And consequently, in September 1434, a signoria wholly supportive of the Medici was elected, and Cosimo was recalled to Florence within a year. This is how he basically had formally received a permission to re-enter the city, while his adversaries had been exiled. Cosimo returned to widespread public support in the expulsion of the Albizzi, who had banished him. His return signaled the end of oligarchic governance at the rise of the Medicean signoria. The Renaissance flourished under Cosimo's de facto leadership of Florence. Its foundations arguably laid way before the Black Death swept through Europe. This is, as I was saying before, just another version, all right, that we became more accustomed with, but that actually deserves a much greater study of its previous history. And we could extend this to so many different aspects. For example, if you study paleography or codicology, you will come across at some point in, of course, as far as Latin paleography, codicology, in Western literature, also as far as vernacular is concerned, with the figure of Niccolò Niccoli. That was the foremost Florentine humanist scholar of the era. He appointed Manuel Chrysoloras, the pioneer of Hellenic studies in Italy, as the first professor of Greek at the University of Florence in 1397. This happens because the Byzantines are gradually fleeing the empire. Again, I will not repeat myself on the fact that, of course, the Italian humanism and Renaissance was booming with or without Byzantine influence that had barely anything to do with that. Boccaccio already held public lessons of Greek to the Florentines, like in the previous generations, and in general, the West was traumatically and disproportionately and scholarly more advanced at any literary, historiographical, scientific, etc. level than anything the Byzantines had at this point. if we assume that they had ever been actually more advanced than the West, which is still a very strong prejudice that inexplicably, I mean, the same Byzantinists told to us that it's not a thing. Like, just study actual historiography, just study what the actual experts say, not cheer for stupid ideas that you gathered by watching other YouTube channels other than Schwerpunkt, or playing too much video games and, sort of alienating from reality, confusing fantasy with history. In any case, we have really an incredible amount of minds working here. It's even embarrassing to list them all, and the thing will continue for generations, as you know, in the case of Italy. When we think of the Renaissance, you know that this is basically born in Florence, right? 15th century Florence is the capital of the Renaissance. Rome is during the 16th century, but in general, this is, that Italian will spread as the third classical language, as also the language of modern Europe in any literary, scientific, artistic, etc. field. From Florentine, I mean, still as, I don't know, for the Germans, like sort of mainstream German is Bavarian, official language standards come from there. Like, just for Italy, Florentine is the official Italian, and of course, like the elite Florentine, not even what is spoken in Florence, say today. And this is valid for, I don't know, the langue de ville in France, Castilian for Spain, etc. Except, again, here you see it's a city that makes it all. So it's not even a region. So the sheer magnitudinal, disproportional explosion of art, of literature, of architecture, and of science also to many different levels, mostly in Florence in a humanistic sense, because after all, we're talking a pre-industrial era where most scientific progress was objectively a matter of, at least was necessarily accompanied mostly by a widely literary and philological understanding, also of the classics and more, had been developing in here. Again, surely on the basis of enormous figures like the Saint Dante, made an entire series about him, Petrarch, Boccaccio. We'll have to talk more in depth about those. That in turn depended on, again, different sort of aspects of Florentine history, like including the victory of this faction as opposed to another. We explained this fairly well in the video, especially about 13th century Florence. The idea that already by the 11th century the Florentine commune had a branch of its administration dedicated to the arts is quite meaningful, but it could have been really another Italian city rather than Florence hadn't specific things occurred. We just see, however, that spirit sort of leaving true and blossoming at this time. An avid collector of ancient manuscripts, the aforementioned Niccoli bequeathed his collection to Cosimo upon his death in 1437. The sheer amount of manuscripts and the best versions of classical philologists were being pioneered in the magnificent Florentine libraries that still exist from this time, and are quite importantly attached to some of the most prestigious institutions, educational institutions in the world. Poggio Bracciolini is another name. He succeeded Niccoli as Florence's leading humanist. He's more famous. We talked about him also in the videos about the Renaissance. So we encounter, even without dedicating entire videos to them, the same figures in these ways. By simply talking, we do that. So more videos will come about each and every of these topics, but we want also to think them again in some more cohesive and comprehensive fashion altogether. Born in Arezzo in 1380, Bracciolini traveled across Europe, gathering ancient Hellenic Roman manuscripts from Niccoli, and unlike his patron, produced his own writings. Right, Arezzo was, and we have to make a video about this too, yet another Tuscan city that had basically fallen under the Florentine lordship. at this point. Another great Aretine that would become very, very loyal to the Florentine broader wealth identity at this point was Leonardo Bruni, which is considered by some the father in sort of modern historiography, as a matter of fact. So it's relevant because there is a whole sense of republicanism, the idea that a bit like in Roman times, basically the Florentine Republic had unlocked the potential of the various cities that had subjugated, so that these great guys, the great talents, had come to basically flourish under her government, was quite widespread and celebrated in the Florentine propaganda. The aforementioned work, by the way, of manuscript recovery was a very old one. The West had never really lost most, especially of Latin literature. The capacity of reading, translating Greek was just another matter. It had never really ended in the West as well. However, when we look at the great humanistic, literary, philological revival, the classics, etc., we're mostly looking at a major manuscript research in the great capitulary archives of Europe, right? Petrarch, that we discussed also in the series about Florence, because he was such an important point of reference also for Charles of Bohemia, the Avignon papacy, etc., toured as an emissary, as an ambassador for all these various powers. All of Europe, just imagine doing that, touring 14th century Europe, and especially the cathedral archives, to search for these marvels. And these guys' private libraries would become treasures that at some point would be safeguarded, at some point dismembered during inheritance or stuff like that, but gradually accumulating something ever more systematic that is taking shape, especially in Italy. And again, as far as the influence of Greek, especially like also of Hebrew and translations from the Arab, this had been going on from centuries. And most of the times, the pattern was the Westerners, when leaving, especially through the Italian Maritime Republic and tradeways for the Eastern libraries, or wherever these manuscripts were preserved, they already knew what to search, where to find that, and being able to translate it and treasure it on their own, something that we do not see in the same Byzantine or Arab world that was much more socioeconomically sclerotic, and there was just a very sort of courtly elite doing stuff. This is very Hellenistic. This was identical to the ancient world. I mean, paradoxically, the Romans read more than the Greeks actually did, because they were more egalitarian, more republican. In many ways, they gave more importance to the individual, so that when you look at this Italian humanism, you can see also how certain things had never really ended. Nobody read that stuff in the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic world, right? There wasn't like a group of people that normally was literate, that could live in a republic, could exchange books. It was so highly and ultra educated as a private citizen, holding this post also in politics. None of this, right? So the notion that this was triggered by some sort of external manuscripts from the East is a pile of BS, is being completely debunked by all Byzantinistic historiography available. And that for some reason people still believe this is like Europe exited the Dark Ages because a bunch of Byzantine refugees went over to Italy. No, right? They were just great figures coming from there, but there were overall a few, and absolutely, let's say, exceptional in their own originary background, and in fact, like completely incapable of replicating in their own way anything the Italians had at this point, and in fact, mostly being integrated into the Italian system that was already that advanced and having surpassed their own system by giving them the space for them. So let's be incredibly straightforward here. This is not a matter of personal opinion. We should absolutely cancel the idea that personal opinion is worth anything if it's not substantiated by actual historical accuracy. And these are incredibly important points, not just in the history of science, but also of economics, in the broader history of thought. I mean, if you truly, as a fully say, as an adult person, you still come to think that there may be something radically wrong with your personal culture and education. Because if you see the world in this way, basically you can't believe anything, right? You're incredibly easy to mentally manipulate. Cosimo was the closest friend of Bracciolini, which was also quite meaningful, and appointed him Chancellor of Florence shortly before his death. This was an incredibly prestigious post, and this is, yes, a typically Renaissance context. So it is a courtly context as well, but again, nothing in comparison to not just like a Byzantine or Arab courtly context, not even a French or an English one, right? This is by far, as we were saying before, with the paradox of the despots, of the tyrants, applied to, again, the single most republican egalitarian system in Europe at this point, and also, as we've seen, the richest, the most educated per capita, so not in a broader sort of absolute big sense, right, but literally in qualitative terms, is absolutely incomparable and nothing that anyone at this point had ever achieved in medieval times, and arguably because of its distinctive characteristics ever, right? Besides, in 1439, Florence hosted the Great Ecumenical Council aimed at reconciling the Byzantine Eastern Orthodox Church with Roman Catholicism, for the most obvious reason that the Byzantines felt they were sinking, and they were doing everything as possible, including trying to reunite the two churches, of course, under the edge of the papacy, as they were growing increasingly depending on their survival on the West, which is also the reason, by the way, they opened the gates to the Turks, because that's literally how it ended. It's not like the Westerners' fault. It's literally the Greeks sort of backfired in terms of broader allegiances, and that is definitely not a good place where to be, because, again, Ottoman society definitely wouldn't help Byzantine society to gap any sort of distance with the West in a broader cultural and, again, literary, you can argue, but also scientific, whatever, civilizational sense later on. And that's also the extent by which we're talking like the underdevelopment of the Byzantine system by this time. Convened by Pope Eugenius IV in response to a desperate appeal from Emperor John VIII Palaiologos of the Byzantine Empire, whose territories were being gradually overtaken by the Ottoman Turks, the council greatly enhanced Florence's international standing, because it truly had an ecumenic scope, right? Deliberations continued until July 1439, culminating in a compromise with the Pope agreeing to provide military support to the Byzantine Emperor. However, upon John VIII's return to Constantinople, the Greeks themselves rejected the agreement, sparking riots across the remaining Byzantine territories. And this is exactly what we were telling before. The emperors were to do the right thing. I will not digress on the general sort of ecumenical implications of this all. I have an incredibly larger amount of mentally disturbed people coming up with the notion that the Westerners were somehow schismatic. I don't know if they have the palest idea of what the Orthodox... They even use the term Orthodox as some sort of opposition to Catholicism, even though they don't know that their own church is called Catholic, or at least these are not even Orthodox people. These are most of the times mentally diseased people who think that Orthodoxy, the so-called Orthodoxy, is something actually more Orthodox than Roman Catholicism. And, I think we have to teach them a bit of medieval ecclesiastical history, or even simply, Christian, Catholic, and even Indo-European theology, to understand how completely out of touch with reality this, and in fact, must be a feministic fantasy from lesser people disconnected from the system. That's how it's happening today. But in fact, it's also unworthy to address to an extent. If you don't know this, it's a bad punishment enough for you. In 1453, in fact, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, mostly because, again, the Byzantines themselves decided that and accept their emperor, and some of the Italians that, because of their private vested interest, in the Byzantine Empire fought and died in the defense of Constantinople were Westerners. In any case, it is true that in general, like the fall of Constantinople was just a general. By that point, let's say it didn't even have to happen, because even the 1453 siege was not like this, again, a walk in the park for the Turks. But indeed, we're living in a time in which the entire world is exhausted, to the point that the same expansion of the Ottoman Empire is a reflection of that rather than of any actual mounting power per se, in qualitative terms. And so it's mostly always about the decisive moral majority of the subjected people that decide to have that kind of government. And indeed, the Greeks decided to be ruled by Muslim rulers, as opposed to be part of a broader, more advanced, more powerful, and more performing Western system. And that's also how we pay at the end of the day for this. For not talking about the Balkans, etc. Now, despite damage to numerous buildings from the September 28, 1453 earthquake, by the way, I made a video about the Porcari Rebellion in Rome, the attempted coup against the Pope, in that Republican bias that existed even among the Roman people at that point. So the general, also in that case, sort of lack of interest towards Constantinople and the general mood of the people. You have this earthquake in Florence, which seems sort of ominous, of a magnitude of 7 on the Mercalli scale. We're talking 5 the Richter one, so it's a pretty devastating one. And paradoxically, for telling you how actually prosperous Florence at this time is, that regardless of the damage, it's terrifying. Consider that, of course, like at the time, didn't build. I mean, some of the things were really, really well built. But let's say most of the others were not so resistant to like today's engineering to earthquakes. Like this spoke volumes about the resilience and the capacity, the genius of the Florentines, as the city kept thriving in spite of all. Cosimo's dedicated patronage transformed Florence, in fact, into the quintessential Renaissance city, employing artists of the caliber of Donatello, Brunelleschi, and Michelozzo at cost exceeding 600,000 florins. Sometimes we don't understand how important art was to these people. We discussed the broader meaning of the Renaissance, of humanism. Of course, investing in these treasures of art, just like today, does not reveal just exquisite tastes and some greater understanding of the world through them, which are, if you know also the art of the time, is incredibly traditional, incredibly sacred, incredibly classical, and sort of heading towards back to the primigenial, and also enriched by the medieval experience, for that matter, but also incredibly costly, like in a sense, incredibly worth it. There are some interesting anecdotes also from later history where you had, I don't know, like some of, for example, Botticelli's painting that one commissioner, I think it was in Florence, argued like cost too much, like as far as what the same Botticelli had asked. And so they called Michelangelo, who was actually not a great... He didn't like Botticelli as a person, rather not liking his art. In fact, he actually looked at the art and said, this is worth double time what he actually asked you, recognizing the incredible relevance of certain works of art in a deeper sense that really needs some elevation to understand. Cosimo was in charge between 1434 and 1464, maintaining the Florentine Republic's formal system, but securing these various councils. This was and tribunals. This was in particular the Balia degli Squittini, which granted him authority to select, as we were saying before, candidates for communal offices. Because all this still works as a commune, basically. And the survival, as we've seen, all these various councils in a non-really centralizing fashion, allowed all the sort of the powerful of Florence to have their own share of government. It had been important in Florentine history, and in that sense, a broader demiurge, so to say, that could allow the system to still be run, but through the protection of a broader private wealth, such as the astronomic one, again, of the Medici Bank, really was acceptable to the system. Though officially a private citizen himself, Cosimo effectively ruled as Florence's de facto lord. And in fact, this is a bit like the hypocrisy of Florence, that is not that far from the other Italian signories, but it's definitely the most republican of them all. It's not a coincidence that you have this greater thriving, because obviously the maintenance of some sort of greater distribution of quality among the citizenry, or at least its oligarchy, does allow for a sort of more nuanced discourse, some broader critical capacity, some greater liberty and openness, right? At the cost, of course, of being a more dysfunctional system, at least not developing as a fully fledged military expansionistic power, becoming gradually more vulnerable, in fact, to the other states that had mostly invested in that direction instead. Cosimo formed a triumvirate, so to say, with his brother Lorenzo, so not his grandson, the Magnificent, and cousin Averardo, surrounded by a network of artists and informants. Right? He was sort of a appreciated person. There were anecdotes regarding the fact of quitting a meeting for a while in front of very important figures and dignitaries to play with his grandchildren, just to show them how sort of a common person from one side he was, but also how much he cared about his house and how much power he actually owned within the same Florence and through the same Florentine, especially financially, stand in Europe. Despite suspicion, Cosimo faced no actual, say, direct opposition, due paradoxically to Florence's ongoing crisis as well. The system needed to recover from, as we've seen, different upheavals. There is a level of exhaustion. The reason why he rose to power was that widespread need, as we've seen, that emerged at the rise, or as a cause actually of the affirmation of seigniories, of protection, right? Of having some kind of strong band that puts things back together. This obviously had happened at the extent of some erosion of public authority, etc. So it's not really a positive thing overall, but it is mostly consensual. It falls into the broader need of the population that accepts that, right? Cardinal Cossa, anti-pope under the name of John the 23rd, admired Cosimo's seriousness and invited him to the Council of Constance in 1414. Months ago I made a video about the great councils of late medieval Europe, and that's yet another topic that we have never really addressed, which is, again, embarrassing enough, but we will, of course, make up for it. Now, when Cossa, due to his condition, was deposed and imprisoned, Cosimo and other papal supporters fled, by the way, from the council. This naturally was before Cosimo had come to power. In fact, it was when Cossa was deposed and imprisoned and given to his status that Cosimo and other papal supporters fled, and the Gonfaloniere Guadagni in Florence recalled Cosimo to the city, but had him arrested at the Palazzo della Signoria in 1433. All right. Definitely the Medici had orchestrated some conspiracy from 1378 to 1431. They had been in the midst of power. If you look at them, again, they had gradually rising to the top. They had been involved in some sort of mechanism, but at least in the later period, things had tried to get a bit through, especially an external support, right? The entrance of Cosimo had been like a triumph, so sanctioning sort of official traditional power as well, as the Albizzi had been exiled. Until his death in rule, Cosimo kept Florence neutral in the external picture as well. That was a sort of an attitude of his. Foreign relations, both during Cosimo's rise and the first 2 decades of his rule, were shaped by the wars in Lombardy, which, again, we've seen in some videos about the condottieri, mostly between 1423 and the so-called treaty/Peace of Lodi in 1454. Between mostly, again, the Venetian Republic and the Duchy of Milan for the dominance in northern Italy and all the other powers involved. You can argue, again, that Florence was remaining at the window mostly because it had been priorly beaten, and it had felt like the fatigue, especially given the costs of the war in general. Cosimo had, of course, a broader sort of understanding of economic policy, so we have to follow partly his insight. Various Italian states shifting alliances based on their interests were naturally involved. In this kind of game, Filippo Maria Visconti of Milan invaded Florence twice in the 30s of the 15th century, again in 1440. So again, we're not trying to skirt around sort of the main events here, but we also have to leave that for some more in-depth video. If anything, at that point, because Florence was always active, sort of infiltrating somewhere. Again, the Medici were as aware as any other Florentine government of the importance of garrisoning the Apennine Passes, maintaining an important military presence, having condottieri forces available to defend the Republic and so on. And there is this major sort of exception in Florentine military history as far as victories are concerned, because again, the Florentines were not so, say, warlike compared to, especially, its neighbors in practice. And there's a decisive victory of Anghiari scored by the Florentine army over the ones of Filippo Maria Visconti. This was a great success. It's a very interesting battle. We will surely make a video about this. There is also, again, famous art celebrating it. By the way, the Florentine host at Anghiari was led by Cosimo's cousin Bernardetto de Medici. The Medici aligned Neri of Gino Capponi and Micheletto Attendolo, that was, as you know, quite involved in Milanese affairs and eventually would also, step up with his house, etc. These invasions were largely spurred, by the way, by the exiled Albizzi, or at least, they derive from sort of broader international issues. But of course, the exiles of Florence, as by tradition, historically for any other power, were trying to invite these other powers over to install them as the rulers of Florence. Back in the previous position, and knowing a lot of affairs, of course, occurring in Florence, especially as early as this, before sort of the Medici really anchored themselves for good with their house, with their control to the city. Filippo Maria's death in 1447 is yet another very important moment in Italian history. This prompted, in fact, significant alliance shifts. Over the next 7 years, the Venetian-Florentine League made, in fact, steady gains. The Visconti's weakening, exacerbated by, in some cases, some condottieri's behavior, such as Piccinino's stubbornness, enabled Venice to conquer Ravenna in 1441, while Florence secured San Sepolcro's allegiance, purchased from Pope Eugenius IV for 25,000 florins. This was an Apenninic city or town that at the frontier with the Papal States would help securing especially the Florentine eastern flank. In 1450, Cosimo's ally Francesco Sforza finally became Duke of Milan. This changed a lot. Internationally wise, Florence's trade interests led it to back Sforza's Milan against Venice, contrary to what had been happening, as we've seen with the historical Florentine-Venetian alliance. Besides, the Venetian markets after the 1453 fall of Constantinople had been weakened, and it would have been inconvenient, disadvantageous for the Medici finances to invest more in there than in the consolidating Milanese state. It was really an impressive thing. We talked about this also in the video about the Milanese armor production, the business model behind that. Were also lots of Florentine, Medici and Florence right behind that at this point. The Peace of Lodi. It's also, again, it's a bit difficult to tell the story so condensed because it's huge, but, these major sort of steps in Italian political organization that aimed at fundamentally solidifying against the potential Ottoman, but mostly other foreign European threat, realizing that any broader breakthrough between the major powers in Italy was would have been too costly for anyone to fundamentally gain the upper hand. Again, it's not like Milan or Venice would give up that enterprise. We have seen, for example, in the aforementioned battles of Caravaggio and Molinella, that these clashes with another outcome would have likely brought to the hegemonization of central and northern Italy, depending on the circumstances, by either Venice, mostly Venice at this point, because they had actually become incredibly effective and as aggressive with their terra firma state. So even though, as we've seen, 1453 had sort of balanced a bit the power up, even the Florentines as historical allies were wary that, if the Milanese had been finally defeated, or defeated at some point, because again, if you lose an entire army, as in the case possibly of Caravaggio, there would have been a major, first of all, the swarming of Venice across the entire region and unpredictable outcomes. The Peace of Lodi was a very complex set of agreements between Italian powers that form, in fact, the so-called Italic League. These agreements ultimately recognized Venetian and Florentine territorial gains, as well as Sforza's rule in Milan, with the Milan-Florence alliance at this point stabilizing the peninsula for the next 4 decades. All right. This had also brought to the historical shift in favor of the House of Aragon in southern Italy. But there were also, again, different mechanisms that would play, as it's notorious also in the time of Lorenzo, with the war against, say, Neapolitans. The Treaty of Lodi is, again, one of the few topics that I discuss about the Italian 15th century in some sort of bigger depth, meaning, it's a big topic, but it really deserves some broader approach to it. I don't know why, again, this later medieval history has, from the cycle, popped up less often. Again, I'm fixing this. I hope to extend this also to other countries like Germany, Scandinavia, and more, because it really deserves so much. As far as the Lodi settlement, it's a major topic because, in theory, the system that was created at that point would last, especially through the workings of Lorenzo de Medici until, in fact, just a few years after his death in 1492. These are important dates, like 1453-54, Constantinople, 100 Years' War, 1492, Columbus discovers America. So it's sort of like a big topic. Like in 1494, Charles VIII invades Italy. And so it's a fully different era that we'll have also to discuss. Just the other day, I, again, randomly had from the Modern Warfare series something on the Italian artillery of the Italian wars that, oddly enough, is a radically under-documented thing, even though, again, the Italians were fairly advanced, but by not being able to put together like some sort of cohesive national force, they ended up mostly quarreling with one another and letting, in fact, the foreigners take over some entire states in the process. So it's a bit the bottom line of the Lodi Agreement. It was some sort of passive-aggressive settlement by powers that really were at each other's throat, but thought that some objectively there was some positivity to it. It was a general awareness, for example, of Italianness and, say, Italian political and strategical interests. It's like, I don't know, what would bring to the Battle of Fort Novo against Charles VIII, the sense that an Italic League could save, let's say, the independence, the virtual independence of the peninsula. The main problem was with the end of the 100 Years' War, the re-expansion of French power. That was the thing that especially the Italians were seen coming in function of Aragon that had taken over southern Italy. Also the fact that the French had some dynastic claims with Milan, since the Visconti had been marrying to them. So there are some sort of genealogical reasons for but it's mostly, as we documented in some satisfactory amount of videos on 15th century French history and warfare, some broader direction, like a unified France tendentially vies for Italy, tries to sort of take over the Netherlands, the Rhineland, and so it's a bit like the chapter we have discussed also recently in the video with the Dutch about the Dutch revolt, in other say general conflicts that I want to expand a bit more, because 16th century warfare is really important. Also, as far as the Italian wars, that, as you know, were called Italian wars because they started and had as their major theater Italy, but also shifted towards Flanders and all what we know. It's all that deeply intertwined. Europe is really becoming more cohesively European, but in this sense more, in fact, interdependent from one another. There's a political crisis in general, right? Actually, I wanted to finish by saying that the Treaty of Lodi was about basically every power promising not to step into each other's territory, not to storm even a little castle here and there. There is a broader mockery that Guicciardini later made of this. And the system actually held. It's not like there wasn't warfare in general. In fact, there were even some fully fledged attempts of taking over the system once again, especially from the side of Venice. But it is true that there was some, at that point, Italian awareness of the importance of that general compaction, the fact that Italian affairs should have hopefully remained into Italian hands. There is in 1458 a political crisis presenting the first major challenge to the Medician rule. In fact, historically, even in these decades, war costs had disproportionately burdened Florence's prominent families, particularly the Medician rivals, leaving, for example, houses like the Serragli, the Baroncelli, Mancini, Vespucci, and Gianni nearly bankrupt and forced to sell properties, which Medici supporters bought at low prices at that point. And so there was this general discontent among some aristocrats. These are minor families overall, but still powerful enough, that realized that the Medici are a bit behind all of this, and they're profiting from their collapse. Also for a policy that was essentially public, because war, touched like the entirety of the state that was de facto run by the Medici. In some ways, it had happened also just because of broader international reasons that now we're not going in the depths of. But the Medici could profit also from broader crises to take out their rivals. So they were not sabotaging Florence because they would have earned much more by having Florence winning, but military expenses that were necessary to a degree had at least this sort of relatively positive side effect, at least as far as the Medici house was concerned. And so their opposition, exploiting a temporary loosening of Medicean control over republican institutions, demanded political reforms Things like free speech in councils and greater decision-making roles. Of course, the Medici had behind the scenes orchestrated a very sort of efficient propaganda, sort of regime control, and not one that could, however, even suppress all the dissent. Hence, the Medici faction countered with threats from private and Milanese forces. Remember that Milan was allied now, so the idea was, okay, like if we're not powerful enough, we'll have our Ambrosian allies come with arms and repress any possible rebellion. This, however, does not look good in many ways, especially because of what we said before, that the same Florence is becoming more dependent on allies, right? The triangle Florence, Milan, Venice had historically started on the basis of some relative, if not power equality, but fundamental, let's say, scalar similarity. At this point, Milan was really becoming the critical mass of this, also Venice equally. And Florence was a bit squeezed, and again, in the Milanese field, mostly dependent thus on it, because again, you have to think any other Italian state having spies, assassins, or something that trying anything to destabilize the system, whatever the disgruntled Florentine opposition could be about, it was prompted by other powers as well. There's the papacy in between, there's Naples, etc. This will be all the more evident in the next episode about Lorenzo the Magnificent government. Cosimo at that point convened a popular assembly that was dominated by his allies, which exiled opponents and introduced open council voting to expose anti-Medici rebels. So there's a sort of opinion crime countering the Medici that would lead to exile. This tells you again how much of a lordship and some kind of tyranny, actually saying Florentine signoria, really was. In 1458, Cosimo also established the Council of the 100. This was an extra one that had to hopefully tend to some form of direction of power concentration. And so surpassing a little bit the other councils in importance, because it would have been more directly managed by the same Medici. From there on, Cosimo, however, withdrew from public roles. This does not bring to a loosening of his grip on Florence. Actually, the contrary is true. But the notion here is that, again, there's been some kind of bad sort of blood, some sort of malaise, for which Cosimo decides to add some sort of extra control, but he withdraws from the scenes. He wants to, he's not a Sullan in that sense. He's there, he controls the system, but he's not so emphatically out there, imposing also his image or whatever, and through this he hoped to counterbalance the general issue. Naturally, much of what he did in terms of political repression was also motivated by the ambition and the arrogance of the other parties that in many ways, again, felt that, again, there were Florentine citizens, there were powerful houses, very rich and influential people. They wanted their own share of Florence. They didn't like this simple arrangement where just one family lorded over the others. So remember, it had been in Florentine blood to have a republican outlook, all right? And as such, there have been different definitions in the Florentine Commonwealth or stuff like that. But otherwise, it's a very traditional context, even in terms of this aristocratic power game, all right? Najemi, The History of Florence, is a good book if you are craving for sources or whatever. I had an exam actually on that back at university, and it's a very good text. It's a pleasant read. You can read on the beach or whatever, in the shade between a bath and another. It sort of explains well this passage, at least. Of course, it's not so sharply political or military or whatever. It analyzes a bit like the institutional system and whatever, but it's good. In spring 1459, Cosimo hosted Pope Pius II, Piccolomini. That was such announced Silvio, who was such a great humanist in his own regard. He had such, like we've read him also as far as the description of the Hussites and their tactics or something like that. The Pope was at that point en route to the Council of Mantua in northern Italy to proclaim a crusade against the Ottomans, which is a good thing to do, especially after, again, the various, this is the period of the Crusade of Belgrade, of Unyadio, that kind of very interesting moment, which the Ottomans, by the way, could have been thrown back to Anatolia, like losing St. Constantinople. It was all feasible to an extent. Cosimo also hosted Galeazzo Maria Sforza, that was Francesco Sforza's son, as this commander was accompanying the Pope from Florence to Mantua himself. In his memoir, Pius described Cosimo as, quote, the arbiter of war and peace, the regulator of law, less a citizen than the master of his city. Political councils were held in his home, the magistrates he chose were elected. He was king in all but name and legal status. This is a very powerful statement, especially from a pope and such a great mind like Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, that was also of Tuscan origin for that matter himself. Some asserted that his tyranny was intolerable, right? And so there is this general picture, and whatever the Pope, again, we can't even digress in this case why Piccolomini thought specifically of that, but of course he clearly illustrates what the situation was. Nevertheless, as it happened also often to such a great, powerful man, he was ultimately honored as Pater Patria, so father of the fatherland, for his significant contributions to this to Florence's development and beautification, if we can sort of use this term. And this is well deserved. I mean, this video is just a very poor description of Cosimo's greatness in a broader political, mecenatic, and even personal sense. Right, we just begin to scratch the surface. Following his death, his son Piero succeeded him. He wasn't, however, much of a great ruler as him. He had a severe physical deformity, which thus prevented him even to be a fully effective leader in a broader, also traditional understanding of the time. If you look at what the Italians represented, even just the sort of the transfigured mankind of the classical tradition, there was a very strong sense of genetic selection. If you look at Botticelli's paintings, they are basically that reflection of the Golden Age, and so they looked really at these features. Nevertheless, Piero successfully repelled an attack on the Signoria by Luca Pitti, that is yet another powerful Florentine, and there is the famous Pitti Palace that is one of the most beautiful in Florence. It really gives you the extent of this guy's wealth, power, and just grandeur and prestige. A prudent ruler, Piero, his illness earning him the moniker the Gouty, limited his governance to 5 years only. He had two sons, notoriously Lorenzo and Giuliano, with the elder Lorenzo succeeding him and ruling until 1492, which is something that we're going to see in another episode, and that we're hopefully, in fact, going to describe in even more consistent ways here. I don't know how many hours I spoke, probably not fully 2, but again, for a topic like this, probably not even 4 or 6 hours would be enough. All right, so I'm glad, if anything, because this is what the series gets down to at the end of the day, to have talked in depth about Florence, to have created this bridge that really spans all the Middle Ages. Again, this is such a short video, telling the truth. Again, we like just for the Middle Ages themselves, just the last 50 years. And that we are talking finally about the Medici more, because here, as far as I see, I think we made only one video about the Medici. Well, yeah, paradoxically, we talked about the Medici in 2 videos about the Renaissance, the 16th century. So in a completely different context, but we made one of the first videos by Schwerpunkt that I re-uploaded later was literally Cosimo de Medici, the transformation of a republic, that sort of deals exactly with the same topics and sort of makes sense of them. The video is perhaps more detailed in some ways. Again, that was a very old video. But again, I'm glad to have made this video in particular, and it's just always beautiful to make videos on such specific topics. You see, Medici and Florence is just like a universe on its own. It's just like a dimension on its own. It's the achievement of these Italian humanistic vision that changed in turn the way we see the world through modern Europe, through the Renaissance and beyond, and much of this prestige would be maintained for forever, till today. If you visit Florence, you can see like the vestiges of that specific Renaissance, that specific world, but at the same time, also the vestiges of the Medici, because that is all tied to their prestige, and it's impossible in many ways to sort of go without this awareness, right? I think it's, again, incredibly important and somehow something, again, that really deserves much more attention and videos from my side. In general, Tuscan history is becoming, especially with this series from last year, pretty hefty. Where I see here how many videos? 26 videos about medieval Tuscany. Yeah, we're starting to get into the thing, even though it's not that still abundant to link all the parts in the proper way. Naturally, Florence is less. Florentine history, 13 videos. This is the 14th. With naturally most of Tuscan history, at least on Schwerpunkt so far, has been about Florence. But in fact, I would like to, after Florence, we'll talk, if anything, about some other. We could pass to some southern or central, say, non-Italic kingdom kind of power, such as some regions of southern Italy or central Italy within the Neapolitan kingdom or something like that, because we really have to cover them in some depth, because they're incredibly important and underrated. But if we shift to communes, I will probably normally jump from a region to another, not to be too repetitive. I would like to make Bologna next. It may be a big spoiler, but I haven't prepared a video yet. We have to finish this first. If anything, I am very much, sticking to it till the end. Because in theory, like, this is just like a single episode, like medieval Florence, but we split it for the sake of, all the strategies that we need. However, I would like to come back as soon as possible, especially on Arezzo and Lucca. Then at some point we will talk about I don't know, Pistoia or San Gimignano or Grosseto or whatever, all these other smaller powers. But we covered Pisa, Siena, that was very much old, even before Florence, right? And then we can get a bit into this other Colle, San Miniato. There are many different centers that are really worth taking into consideration. Also because, frankly, here in this series about Europe, we're exhausting the bigger chunks. So either we invent something else. I was thinking about shifting to also characters, not just regions, right? But regions, yeah, I mean, it's cohesive enough. There is... it feels like I still haven't made enough about it, but in fact, it's only closing these gaps of different regions that can help. I have improved means in some ways that can help us getting a bit also into the depths of some other sort of lesser known power in some ways. But I think that, again, everything is relatively ready for it. We'll pass. The next series is on the Balkans, telling the truth. So we are really looking at very cyclical stuff, and there's so much to make about Central Europe as well. And let's see, after months, I don't remember which was the last episode. I think it was something about... I don't even remember, but we have more incoming besides some videos about especially cities. Will come up more often also from other branches of the cycle. I have something on REM, for example, that is so important in many ways. European history, not just in the French one. So again, we just have only the embarrassment of the choice, and I'm glad we can cover these topics. We get the attention on them. It's really all we want in many ways, and these videos are necessary just to get the basics, right? The actual ABC, and then we will get ever more in depth with all the various powers and more. Like for today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.